Joining us now over the phone is Roger McGuinn, founding member of the Byrds. Roger, thanks so much for speaking with me this morning.
My pleasure.
So, Roger, you started the Folk Den project on your website, McGuinn.com, in 1995, where you post one traditional folk song each month. Can you tell me a little bit about why you decided to start this project?
Sure. I was listening to a Smithsonian Folkways album of traditional music in 1995, and it dawned on me that the new breed of folk singers were all singer-songwriters that had become so fashionable that people were neglecting traditional music completely. And maybe a few pockets of it around the world. Canada has always been good about that. Maybe in Boston, around Cambridge, Harvard Square, the Village, there might have been some folk singers doing traditional songs. But for the most part, the new folk singers were all like Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan. They were writing their own stuff. And I thought, what's going to happen to these great old cowboy songs and sea shanties and blues and work songs from the prisons and all the different kinds of, it's not just all coming around the mountain when she comes, it's some great material there, the old child ballads from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And I thought, man, this stuff could disappear. So being a techie, I knew how to record stuff at home and put it up on the internet for free download. And I started doing that in November of 1995, and I just put another one up today. I've got over 272 free MP3s in the Folk Den now, and it's a public service to keep the old songs alive, sponsored by UNC in Chapel Hill.
How do you go about choosing which songs to feature each month?
I don't really. I've got some resources. I sort of waited till the last minute. I recorded the song that's up there now yesterday. And I looked for a song about June, and I found My June Rose, and it's an old English song. I'd never heard it before, but it's been around for a century or so. And I think it was first discovered in 1905, somewhere in Dorchester or some town in England. And I just sort of looked for, a theme. I looked for something with spring in it, like last month I had a song called I Want to Be in Texas for the Roundup in the Spring, and so on.
So a couple years ago, you did a 20th anniversary release from the Folk Den recordings, which was 100 songs that you selected?
Yeah, that was the second 100-song box set we released. The first one was in 2005. To celebrate the 10th year anniversary, and then the last one was in 2015 to celebrate the 20th anniversary.
So on the website, you sort the songs by category, like what the songs are about. When they were first written, it's almost like they were, like you said, telling stories or communicating information.
Yeah, well, that's what they are. Before we had books, we had people doing the oral tradition with songs, and it kept our history alive.
So I saw you perform a couple of months ago in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, and in the performance, you took the audience through how your career began. You originally started performing in folk clubs around the country before you got into rock and roll.
Right. Well, actually, I got into rock and roll first. I was into Elvis Presley, Gene Vincent, Carl Perkins, and the whole Sun Records kind of rockabilly thing. And then I discovered folk music after that and really went whole hog into it and ignored rock and roll for a while. And then after working with Bobby Darin, I heard the Beatles, and they revitalized my rock and roll love. So, and then I found that the Beatles were using folk music chord changes, and it gave me the idea of mixing folk and rock.
When you first met Gene Clark and David Crosby, did you share that common bond of loving folk music?
Yes, we both have been in the folk circles, not as deeply as, say, Bob Dylan, but we were on the fringe of it, And then we both liked the Beatles, so we had that in common. And that was the common thread that we had to write songs together. Gene said, let's write some songs, see what happens.
When you were performing the folk clubs at that time, were you doing some of the traditional songs that you're doing now, or was it more just backing up some of the songwriters at that time?
I was doing traditional material, and I was, I had a repertoire of traditional songs.
So you first purchased your first Rickenbacker guitar because you saw George Harrison playing it in the Hard Day's Night movie?
That's right. We did a reconnaissance run. We all went to see the Beatles movie, A Hard Day's Night, and took notes on what the Beatles were playing. And then we got a loan from this lady in L.A. and went to the music store and bought all the instruments we could find. I think the only one we couldn't find was the Hofner violin bass, but we got the Rickenbacker. I think Chris got a Guild bass, but we got the Gretsch guitar that George had been playing, and a set of Ludwig drums like Ringo was playing.
And then, in turn, the Beatles saw you using the Rickenbacker guitar with Mr. Tambourine Man, and it influenced them with songs like If I Needed Someone.
Right. Well, the riff from The Bells of Rumney is da-da-do-do-do-do, just like If I Needed Someone, the melody of If I Needed Someone. And I remember the day that Derek Taylor, who had been the Beatles press officer, came over from London, came to my house and said, George wants you to listen to this, and he wants you to know that he wrote this song based on your riff from The Bells of Rumney. So I went, wow, this is like, we'd been inspired by the Beatles, and now we had inspired the Beatles. So it's really a great full circle.
Interesting how that works. It's similar to like the Beatles were influencing the Beach Boys and back and forth, and there were a few bands around that time that were just influencing each other, adding new dimensions to rock and roll music at that time.
It even happened with the Rolling Stones, and after we did the Sweetheart of the Rodeo, Graham Parsons started hanging out with Keith Richards, and they did Wild Horses.
Right, that's when they got into their country blues phase around that same time as well.
Right.
So you came in contact with the Beatles after Mr. Tambourine Man, they heard it, and did you meet with them at that time, around mid-60s?
Yeah, Derek Taylor moved to L.A. and took on some new clients, the Byrds, the Beach Boys, Paul Revere and the Raiders, and Mamas and Papas. And he accompanied us to England on our tour, 1966, I believe it was. And so he arranged a meeting with, the first night I got to meet George and John, and then the next night I met Paul. And we hung out with them at parties. Paul drove us around London in his Aston Martin DB5, his James Bond car, and it was really exciting. We the Beatles and the Stones hung out together with each other. I was amazed at that.
Yeah, it seems like they're just like almost opposites of each other. I mean, style-wise, and then they're just hanging out and good buddies as well.
Yeah, well, if you look, there were some similarities. Both John and Mick Jagger had gone to art school.
Do you think that the success of Mr. Tambourine Man helped convince Bob Dylan that going electric was a good idea for his own career?
Well, he started out electric, he was influenced by early rock and roll bands around the same time I was in the 50s, before he got into folk music, before he discovered Woody Guthrie. So he had a background in rock and roll, but I think it was in the air. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and then the Byrds got a #1 hit with his song. I think we had some influence on him, yeah.
Do you think that he was a little bit surprised or like pleasantly like, oh, wow, this music really could be at the top of the charts as well, and just instead of just being in folk communities?
Well, he changed his tune. He stopped doing traditional songs, and he started playing electric instruments and was called a Judas by some people. And so I think, but he heard the Rolling Stones, and then his great song, Like a Rolling Stone, obviously they had influenced him.
Right. And then you became friends with Dylan at that point as well?
Well, we were acquainted. I don't know if I could say he was my friend. We hung out together. I toured with him a couple of times, but He's always like an older brother to me. He's a year older, and you know how it is in high school when you're like a junior and the seniors are a little bit aloof. Yeah, it's always been like that. It's always been like that. I've always loved the guy like a brother, but we've had some good times together. I have some pictures of me and Bob laughing at Gordon Lightfoot's house on the Rolling Thunder tour. We've had a lot of good times together, but I haven't seen him for a long time. I think the last time I saw him was in Japan. I went to Tokyo with Steve Wozniak, not to drop names, but we saw him at the Budokan, and that was the last time I saw him, really.
And in the show that I saw a few months ago, you told the story about the movie Easy Rider and how they approached Bob Dylan about writing the theme tune, but then he told Peter Fonda to give it to you instead.
That's right. He wrote some notes on a cocktail napkin and gave it to Peter and told Peter to give it to me, that I'd know what to do with it, which I did.
Song The Ballad of Easy Rider.
Yes, it turned out to be the theme song from Easy Rider. And he'd written The River Flows to the Sea, wherever that river goes, that's where I want to be, flow, river, flow. And I came up with a second verse, and he had a chorus, let your waters wash down, take me from this town, so on. So, yeah, it was, and I told him the story in the show, I gave him the credit for the song, and he called me up a few weeks later and said, hey, take this credit off, I don't need the money.
Right, you'd already, with Mr. Tambourine Man being such a huge hit and My Back Pages, he was good to go.
Yeah, well, we were kind of his cover band for a while. And then everybody started covering him, so like Jimi Hendrix and the Turtles.
Right, yeah.
The whole folk rock movement, yeah.
Did the Byrds ever play with him like the band did?
Yeah, not on a tour. He sat in with us at Ciro's. You can find a picture of that on the back cover of the Mr. Tambourine Man album. And then there was a time when Clive Davis arranged for the Byrds to be his backing band in the studio in New York. And it was during the Clarence White days of the Byrds, the later days, like in the 70s. And I had the band with me on the road. And so Clive was supposed to let us know when the sessions were, but the weekend went by and my drummer, Gene Parsons, got so antsy that he flew home. And that sort of put the kibosh on the whole thing. So, Clive has always blamed the Byrds for not showing up, but that's basically what happened, yeah.
Yeah, it would make sense that the Byrds would play with him, I guess. Just playing so many of his songs throughout the years.
Oh, yeah, it was like when Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers were his backing band on that world tour they did together, and I was allowed to be on a leg of that in 1987. It was called the Temples in Flames Tour, and I toured Europe with them for a couple of months.
Is that when you wrote the song King of the Hill with Tom Petty?
Yes, it is. We had a day off in Gothenburg, Sweden, and I had a tune I showed Tom, and he said, hey, let's write it. So we'd both been reading this book by John Phillips called Papa John, which was his autobiography. And at the time, Tom thought it was kind of an interesting subject to write a song about, so we wrote about that.
When you first heard Tom Petty, were you thinking to yourself, wow, this is like such a tribute to me? He's just like trying to do a lot of what the Byrds did.
Yeah, the first time I heard him, it was I was getting ready to do an album called Thunderbird for Columbia, and I had most of the songs all done, but needed some outside material, and my manager was around the corner putting on records and tapes, and I couldn't see what he was putting on, and he put on American Girl. And I was kidding my manager. I said, hey, when did I record that?
Right.
And he said, it isn't you. It isn't you. And I said, I know. I would remember writing a song like that. And so I recorded American Girl on the Thunderbird album, and I asked my manager to put me together with Tom, and I got to meet him. And in fact, we went on tour together. I think we played the Bottom Line for a week or something like that.
In the mid-'60s, you went from being known as Jim McGuinn to Roger McGuinn. Was that a challenge at first to get that to catch on, that people knew you as Jim?
Yeah, it was. I was committed to this Eastern spiritual thing, and the guy from Indonesia said that you'd vibrate better with the universe, and I thought, wow, groovy, I'll give it a shot. So, so I did, and a lot of people thought Jim McGuinn was the lead guy in the Byrds, and he'd gone down to Rio or left the hurly-burly of show business, and his brother Roger had taken over, and he wasn't quite as good as Jim.
It's interesting because I don't know if people realize that you were known as Jim McGuinn for a while. I mean, into the success of the Byrds before going to Roger.
Yeah, I guess until about 68. Yeah, it changed or 67, I think I changed my name. Well, what really happened was I had, my first son was going to be called James Joseph McGuinn IV, because I was James Joseph McGuinn III after my father was a junior, right? And so I thought, well, I got into this spiritual thing, and I thought, well, people were changing their names. A lot of people, like Richmond Shepard became Lionel Shepard, or Lionel Shepard became Richmond Shepard, and Bob Camp became Hamilton Camp, and Jimmy Gavin changed his name too. I forget what he changed it to, but it was something going on. So I sent away to Indonesia to see what my son's name should be, and he came back with the name Patrick McGuinn, right? And then I had another son, and he called him Henry. So like Patrick Henry, give me liberty, give me death, right? I gave it. So I thought I'd give it a shot. So I did, and I sent the guy 10 names that started with an R, and he picked the name Roger, and it was the only real name in the batch because I was into sci-fi, and I gave him names like Rocket. I could have been Rockin' Rocket McGuinn.
Interesting. In the 60s also, with a track like 8 Miles High, I remember you were talking about some jazz influences for the Byrds at that time as well. Was that mainly coming from David Crosby or from other people as well?
We were on tour in the States. It was like a bus tour, and we stopped somewhere in the Midwest where Crosby had a friend who had Coltrane's latest album, which happened to be called India and Africa. It was like a double record set. And we'd been into Ravi Shankar because Ravi was on World Pacific Records, and Jim Dixon, our manager, was a producer engineer at World Pacific. So we had Ravi stuff. So we had Ravi Shankar and John Coltrane. I bought a little Philips cassette recorder in London, and it was so new that they didn't have any pre-recorded cassettes. So I dubbed Ravi Shankar on one side of a 60-minute cassette, or a 30-minute cassette probably, and John Coltrane on the other. And we listened to that on the bus tour for a month. And by the time we got back to L.A. in the studio, we were steeped in this raga and jazz combination.
Right, and then you can hear that with like the intro to 8 Miles High, that lead guitar part that you were doing.
Yeah, it's the intro and the lead break and the outro. And people misunderstood it. They didn't know what the source was, so they thought we were just being psychedelic. And it had the word high in it. And the record got banned by the Gavin Report. There was a tip sheet for radio stations and said, this is definitely a drug song. You shouldn't play it anymore, so they quit playing it.
It's really unbelievable how that was able to happen.
Yeah, it was almost like the McCarthy era. I mean, it was
right.
It was something definite. That doesn't happen anymore. I mean, what's going on the radio is ridiculous.
So you've got the Folk Den project still going. You just finished up a bunch of tour dates, solo tour dates. Do you have any other plans for the rest of 2018?
Yeah, I do. I can't really talk about something until like another week or so. But
okay.
we got something in the works.
Great.
Got something in the works with Chris Hillman and Marty Stewart.
All right, well, I'll look forward to that. We'll head over to McGuinn.com for updates, as well as Roger McGuinn on Facebook.
Yeah, there should be a press release pretty soon, but for legal reasons, I can't talk about it at this point.
All right, well, Roger, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me this morning, and take care. Good luck with the rest of 2018 and all the rest of your work.
Okay. I did want to stress that the two box sets that we talked about, brand new recordings. They weren't the MP3s from the website we dubbed onto records. So they're full multi-tracks that are down to full CD quality. They're not the old MP3.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time.
Okay. I enjoyed it.